December 24th, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family was celebrating Christmas Eve, 10 children running around, laughter filling the house, presents waiting under the tree. A normal, happy family on the most magical night of the year. George Sodder, the father, was exhausted from work. His wife, Jenny, was getting the younger children ready for bed. The older kids were still awake, excited about Christmas morning. It was just after midnight when Jenny finally got to sleep. The house was quiet, peaceful, everyone safe in their beds. Then at 1 a.m. she woke to the smell of smoke. Fire. The house was burning. Flames were already consuming the walls. Smoke filled the hallways. Jenny screamed for George. He jumped out of bed, started grabbing children. "Get out!" Everyone out. They ran through the smoke. George kicked open doors, pulled kids from their beds, pushed them toward the stairs. "Get outside! Get to safety." Marion, age 17, she made it out. John, 23, safe. George Jr., 16, outside. Sylvia, 9, out. Jenny herself carried 2-year-old Sylvia. They stumbled into the cold December night. The family gathered in the yard, coughing, crying, freezing in their nightclothes, watching their home burn. George counted heads, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wait, he counted again. Where were the others? Maurice, age 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, 5. 5 children still inside? George ran back toward the house. The flames were too intense. The heat pushed him back. He tried again. The smoke choked him. "The ladder!" he shouted. "Get the ladder!" The ladder was always kept against the house, for repairs, for emergencies. But now, in the middle of the night, it was gone. "Where's the damn ladder?" No one knew. George ran to his truck. He'd use the truck to get close to the second-floor windows, ram it against the house if he had to, anything to reach his children. He turned the key. The engine didn't start. He tried again. Nothing. The truck was dead. No. He tried the coal truck. Same thing, dead. Both trucks that had worked perfectly that afternoon suddenly wouldn't start. The fire department. Someone called the fire department. They had no phone. It had been out of service for a week. The phone company said they'd fix it after Christmas. A neighbor. Someone run to a neighbor. But by now the fire had spread. The entire house was engulfed. The heat was unbearable. The family could only stand back and watch. George stared at the second floor, at the windows where his children's bedrooms were, waiting for them to appear, to break through, to jump. The windows stayed dark. No movement, no screams, nothing. The fire department finally arrived. An hour later, an entire hour after the fire started, they sprayed water, but it was too late. The house was already collapsing. The roof caved in. The walls fell inward. By dawn, all that remained was a smoking pile of rubble, charred wood, twisted metal, ash. And somewhere in that debris, George believed, were the bodies of his 5 children. The fire chief approached him. "We'll search for remains once it cools down." George nodded numbly. His children, his babies, gone. But here's where the story gets strange, where a tragedy becomes a mystery. When investigators sifted through the ashes, they found nothing. No bodies, no bones, no teeth, no remains of any kind. 5 children had been in that house. 5 children who couldn't have escaped. But there was no trace of them. The fire chief said, the fire must have burned so hot it completely cremated the remains, turned everything to ash. But George Sodder knew fire. He'd worked in construction. He knew what fire could and couldn't do. A house fire doesn't burn hot enough to completely destroy human bones. Crematoriums use temperatures of 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for hours to reduce bodies to ash. House fires reach maybe 1000 degrees, and they burn fast, not long. There should have been something. Bone fragments, at least. Teeth, something. But there was nothing. George refused to believe his children had died in that fire. If there were no bodies, maybe they hadn't been in the house. Maybe they'd escaped somehow. Maybe they were alive. His wife, Jenny, thought he was in denial, unable to accept the horrible truth. But George was certain. "They're out there," he told her. "Someone took them." "Took them?" "George, that's crazy." "Who would?" "I don't know. But I'm going to find out." The official investigation was brief. Too brief. The fire chief declared it an electrical fire. Faulty wiring, tragic accident, case closed. But George remembered things that didn't add up. The missing ladder. It hadn't walked away on its own. Someone had moved it. The trucks that wouldn't start. Both of them, simultaneously, after working fine all day. The phone line being cut just before Christmas. The phone company claimed it was routine maintenance, but the timing was suspicious. And then there were the strangers. 2 months before the fire, a life insurance salesman had come to the house. George refused to buy. The man got angry. "Your house is going to go up in smoke," he'd said. "And your children are going to destroy you." At the time, George thought it was just sales pressure, scare tactics. But now, after the fire, those words seemed like a threat. And a few days before Christmas, Jenny had noticed a strange car parked on the road near their house. A man sitting inside, just watching. When she looked at him, he drove away. Then on Christmas Eve itself, about an hour before the fire started, one of the younger children said she'd seen a man looking through the window. Jenny thought the child was imagining things. But now she wondered, had someone been watching the house, waiting? George started asking questions, investigating on his own. The authorities had closed the case, but he hadn't. He talked to neighbors. One said they'd seen a strange car speeding away from the Sodder property around the time the fire started. Another neighbor said they'd heard what sounded like an explosion before seeing flames, not the crackling of a spreading fire. An explosion. The fire chief insisted it was electrical. But why wouldn't he allow a proper investigation? Why did he want to close the case so quickly? George requested a more thorough search of the debris. The fire chief refused. Said it had already been examined. Nothing to find. So George hired private investigators. They sifted through the ashes themselves. They found something, a piece of what looked like a human organ, preserved somehow in the debris. George took it to a pathologist. The examination revealed it wasn't human. It was beef liver, placed there deliberately. Someone had planted fake evidence in the ruins of his house. Why? George Sodder's certainty grew. This wasn't an accident. His children hadn't died. They'd been taken, and someone was trying to make it look like they'd burned to death. But who would do this, and why? And most importantly, where were his children? In the weeks following the fire, George Sodder became obsessed with finding the truth. He couldn't sleep, couldn't work. Every waking moment was spent investigating, asking questions, following leads. His surviving children watched their father deteriorate, watched their mother try to hold the family together while grieving 5 missing children. But George refused to accept they were dead. The evidence, or lack of evidence, told a different story. He started documenting everything, every strange detail, every inconsistency, every suspicious occurrence before and after the fire. The ladder that disappeared. George found it eventually, thrown into a ravine about 75 feet from the house. Someone had deliberately removed it and hidden it. The trucks that wouldn't start. After the fire, they worked perfectly. George had mechanics examine them. Nothing wrong. No reason they shouldn't have started that night, unless someone had sabotaged them, temporarily disabled them, then fixed them after the fire. The phone line. George learned it hadn't been cut by the phone company. The line had been physically severed. Someone had climbed the pole and cut it. These weren't accidents. This was planned, coordinated. George went to the police, showed them his evidence, demanded a real investigation. They dismissed him. Grief-stricken father unable to accept reality. That's all they saw. But George wasn't crazy. He was methodical, logical, and increasingly convinced. His children had been kidnapped. Then the sightings began. A woman from Charleston, about 50 miles away, came forward. She claimed she'd seen the Sodder children at a restaurant the morning after the fire. "I'm certain it was them," she said. 5 children matching the descriptions, with 2 men and 2 women. The children looked scared, like they wanted to say something but couldn't. The woman hadn't known about the fire yet, hadn't realized the significance. By the time she learned about the missing children and contacted authorities, days had passed. George begged police to investigate. They did nothing. Too much time had passed. The lead was cold. More sightings followed. A man in Florida claimed he'd seen 4 of the children getting into a car. A woman in South Carolina said she'd served them at a diner. Each time, by the time George learned about it, weeks had passed. The trail was cold, but the sightings continued for years, suggesting the children were alive, being moved around, hidden. George started investigating the life insurance salesman who'd threatened him, the man who'd said the house would burn and the children would destroy George. He learned the salesman wasn't actually from the insurance company. He'd been impersonating an agent. Who was he really? Who sent him? George traced him to a nearby town, but before he could confront him, the man vanished, left the area suddenly. No forwarding address. Then George looked into the fire department's response. Why had it taken an hour for them to arrive? The fire station was only 2 miles away. He interviewed the fire chief, asked pointed questions. The chief became defensive, angry. Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking why you took so long, and why you won't investigate properly. There's nothing to investigate. It was an accident. Then why won't you let me search the site again? Because you're disturbed. Mr. Sodder, you need to accept what happened and move on. But George couldn't move on. Not without answers. He heard rumors, whispers in town. People afraid to speak openly, but willing to hint at things. Someone mentioned the mafia, Italian organized crime. George was Italian-American. Had he angered someone? Refused to pay protection money? George had been outspoken against Mussolini during World War II. He'd criticized Italian fascism publicly. Had that made him a target? Other rumors suggested something darker: child trafficking. The children taken to be sold, used for labor or worse. George followed every lead. Some went nowhere, others opened new questions. A private investigator found evidence that a funeral director had been bribed, told to issue death certificates for the children without bodies. Without evidence. Why would someone pay to have children officially declared dead when no remains had been found, unless they wanted to end the investigation? Close the case, make it impossible to keep searching. George confronted the funeral director. The man denied everything, but he was nervous, sweating, lying. Then came the photographs. In 1947, 2 years after the fire, George received a photograph in the mail. No return address, just a photo of a young boy, about 9 or 10 years old. George's blood ran cold. The boy looked exactly like Louis would have looked at that age. On the back of the photo, someone had written. One said they'd seen a strange car speeding away from the Sodder property around the time the fire started. Another neighbor said they'd heard what sounded like an explosion before seeing flames, not the crackling of a spreading fire. An explosion. The fire chief insisted it was electrical. But why wouldn't he allow a proper investigation? Why did he want to close the case so quickly? George requested a more thorough search of the debris. The fire chief refused. Said it had already been examined. Nothing to find. So George hired private investigators. They sifted through the ashes themselves. They found something. A piece of what looked like a human organ, preserved somehow in the debris. George took it to a pathologist. The examination revealed it wasn't human. It was beef liver, placed there deliberately. Someone had planted fake evidence in the ruins of his house. Why? George Sodder's certainty grew. This wasn't an accident. His children hadn't died. They'd been taken, and someone was trying to make it look like they'd burned to death. But who would do this, and why? And most importantly, where were his children? In the weeks following the fire, George Sodder became obsessed with finding the truth. He couldn't sleep, couldn't work. Every waking moment was spent investigating, asking questions, following leads. His surviving children watched their father deteriorate, watched their mother try to hold the family together while grieving 5 missing children. But George refused to accept they were dead. The evidence, or lack of evidence, told a different story. He started documenting everything, every strange detail, every inconsistency, every suspicious occurrence before and after the fire. The ladder that disappeared. George found it eventually, thrown into a ravine about 75 feet from the house. Someone had deliberately removed it and hidden it. The trucks that wouldn't start. After the fire, they worked perfectly. George had mechanics examine them. Nothing wrong. No reason they shouldn't have started that night, unless someone had sabotaged them, temporarily disabled them, then fixed them after the fire. The phone line. George learned it hadn't been cut by the phone company. The line had been physically severed. Someone had climbed the pole and cut it. These weren't accidents. This was planned, coordinated. George went to the police, showed them his evidence, demanded a real investigation. They dismissed him. Grief-stricken father unable to accept reality. That's all they saw. But George wasn't crazy. He was methodical, logical, and increasingly convinced. His children had been kidnapped. Then the sightings began. A woman from Charleston, about 50 miles away, came forward. She claimed she'd seen the Sodder children at a restaurant the morning after the fire. "I'm certain it was them," she said. 5 children matching the descriptions, with 2 men and 2 women. The children looked scared, like they wanted to say something but couldn't. Louis Sodder. I love Brother Frankie. You little boys. And I know one tried too. Louis Sodder, his son's name. But the message was cryptic, strange. What did it mean? You little boys? Was that a place, a code? A90132, a case number, an address. George hired investigators to trace the photo. Where was it taken? Who sent it? They found nothing. Dead end. But the photo proved something to George. Louis was alive. Someone had him, and they wanted George to know. Was it a taunt? A ransom attempt? A sign that the children were being held somewhere? George tried to respond. Placed ads in newspapers. Louis, if you see this, contact home. We're looking for you. No response. More years passed. George's health deteriorated. The stress was killing him, but he never stopped searching. In 1949, another clue emerged. A tourist passing through West Virginia claimed she'd seen the Sodder children at a rest stop, all 5 of them with a woman who seemed to be their guardian. I recognized them from the photos in the newspapers, the woman said. I'm certain it was them, but when I tried to approach, the woman hurried them away. Again, police did nothing. The sighting couldn't be verified. George began to suspect a cover-up. Someone in authority was protecting whoever took his children, or someone was being paid to ignore evidence. He investigated local officials, judges, police officers, fire department personnel. He found connections. A fire chief with ties to organized crime. A police officer whose brother-in-law was a known criminal. But George couldn't prove anything, couldn't get authorities to take him seriously. By 1950, 5 years after the fire, George made a decision. He'd take his case directly to the public. He erected a billboard on Route 16, a major highway through West Virginia. The billboard displayed enlarged photographs of the 5 missing children. Below their photos, a message. 5 children missing after fire, 5,000 reward for information. The billboard stayed up for decades. George added to it over the years. Updated photos showing what the children might look like as they aged. Thousands of people saw that billboard. Tips came in. Most led nowhere. But George investigated every single one. Some tips were cruel hoaxes. People trying to claim the reward money with false information. George could tell. He knew his children. He'd recognized them. But one tip in 1968 gave him hope again. A woman claimed she'd seen Martha. Now in her 30s, working in a diner in Texas. George and Jenny drove to Texas, spent weeks searching, interviewed dozens of waitresses. Found nothing. George was 70 years old. Jenny was exhausted. Their surviving children begged them to stop, to accept the loss, to let the past go. But George couldn't. They're out there. I know it, and I won't stop until I find them. Jenny was torn. Part of her believed George. Part of her thought he was torturing himself with false hope. What if they are dead? She asked quietly one night. What if we're chasing ghosts? Then I'll chase ghosts until I die, George replied. And he did. For decades, investigators, journalists, and amateur detectives have tried to solve the Sodder children mystery. What really happened on Christmas Eve, 1945? Did the children die in the fire? Were they kidnapped? If so, by whom and why? Dozens of theories have emerged. Some plausible, some wild, none proven. Theory 1, the children died in the fire. This is the official explanation. The fire burned so hot, it completely destroyed all remains. But experts have debunked this repeatedly. Dr. Oscar Hunter, a crematorium operator, examined the scene. His conclusion: impossible. A house fire doesn't burn hot enough or long enough to completely destroy bones. Even in a crematorium, it takes hours at extreme temperature. We always recover bone fragments, always. Forensic pathologists agree. Fire investigators agree. The children should have left remains, unless the fire was somehow unusual. Some have suggested the coal that fueled the house's heating created a hotter fire. But even coal fires don't reach crematorium temperatures. This theory requires believing something that experts say is impossible. Theory 2, the children escaped and got lost. Maybe the children made it out of the house, but became disoriented in the smoke, wandered into the woods, died of exposure. But search teams combed the area. Dogs searched. No trace was found. 5 children wouldn't all wander in the same direction and vanish completely. And if they died of exposure, their bodies would have been found eventually. The woods weren't that dense. This theory doesn't explain the missing ladder, the sabotage trucks, the cut phone line. Theory 3, mafia kidnapping for revenge. George Sodder had been vocally anti-Mussolini. In the 1940s, some Italian-American communities had mafia connections, fascist sympathizers. Could George have angered the wrong people? Could his children have been taken as punishment? This theory explains the planning, the coordination, the threats before the fire. It also explains why authorities might have covered it up. If organized crime was involved, local officials might have been bribed or intimidated into closing the case. The life insurance salesman who threatened George might have been a mafia messenger, delivering a warning that George ignored. When George didn't comply, didn't pay protection, money, or stop his anti-fascist activities, they struck, took his children, burned his house, sent a message. This theory has support from historians who've studied mafia activity in West Virginia during this period. The organization had a presence. They were involved in coal mining, labor disputes, and local politics. But if the mafia took the children, what happened to them? Were they killed, sold, raised by other families? The sightings suggest they were kept alive, moved around, hidden. Theory 4, child trafficking ring. In the 1940s, black market adoption and child trafficking existed. Desperate parents would pay large sums for children they couldn't legally adopt. 5 healthy children from a large family might have been targeted. The fire was a cover story, made it look like the children died so no one would search for them. The children would have been separated, sold to different families across the country, given new identities, raised to forget their past. This would explain the sightings in different states, the children being moved around, different people seeing them with different adults. It would also explain why no ransom was demanded. The kidnappers weren't trying to extort George. They were selling his children. And it would explain the photograph of Louis. Someone involved in the trafficking wanted George to know his son was alive, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps as a taunt. This theory is chilling. It suggests the children grew up not knowing who they really were, never knowing their family was searching for them. Theory 5, witness protection or government involvement. This is the most conspiratorial theory, but some researchers believe the government might have been involved. What if George Sodder had witnessed something, or knew something classified or dangerous? What if the government staged the children's deaths to force George into silence, or to punish him for something? This would explain the cover-up, the authorities refusing to investigate, evidence being ignored or destroyed. It would explain how the kidnappers operated with such coordination and confidence. But there's no evidence of George being involved in anything that would warrant government action. He was a small-town businessman, not a spy, not a criminal. Still, declassified documents from the 1940s show the government did conduct operations involving civilians. MK-Ultra and other programs prove the government was capable of extreme actions. Could the Sodder children have been victims of something classified? Unlikely, but not impossible. Theory 6, the children are buried on the property. Some investigators believe the children died in the fire, but their bodies were removed before official searches. Why? To hide evidence of murder. What if someone killed the children before the fire, set the fire to cover it up, then remove the bodies to prevent autopsies from revealing the real cause of death? This would explain the lack of remains, and the sabotaged escape routes would make sense. The killer wanted to ensure no one could save the children or escape to identify them. But this theory requires the killer to return to the burning house to remove bodies. Risky, difficult, and it doesn't explain the sightings, unless those were all misidentifications or lies. Theory 7. One or more children survived, the others died. Maybe not all 5 children were in the house when it burned. Maybe some had been taken earlier. Others died in the fire. This would explain conflicting evidence. Some remains destroyed, some children alive and hidden elsewhere. But George accounted for all the children at bedtime. All 5 were in their rooms when the family went to sleep, unless someone removed them during the night before the fire started. This theory requires an incredibly narrow timeline. Kidnappers would have had to enter the house, take children, and leave, all without waking anyone, in the hour or 2 before the fire. Possible, but difficult to believe. The truth is, we don't know which theory is correct, or if any of them are. The evidence points in multiple directions. Some facts support kidnapping. Others suggest death in the fire. Still others hint at something stranger. George Sodder died in 1969, 24 years after the fire. He never found his children, never got answers. Jenny Sodder died in 1989. She'd spent 44 years wondering, hoping, grieving. The surviving Sodder children are elderly now. Some have passed away. Others still search for answers. The billboard George erected came down in the 1980s, but the case remained open, technically unsolved. In 1990, new investigators reviewed the evidence. Using modern forensic techniques, they re-examined photographs of the fire scene. They noticed something previous investigators had missed. Electrical wiring visible in photos showed no signs of failure. No short circuits, no burning consistent with electrical fire. The fire chief's original conclusion: electrical. Fire from faulty wiring appeared to be wrong. So how did the fire start? Witnesses who'd heard an explosion before seeing flames suggested accelerants, gasoline or kerosene used to start the fire deliberately. Arson, not an accident. This supports the kidnapping theory. Someone set the fire, used it as cover to take the children. But again, proof is lacking. The original crime scene wasn't preserved. Evidence was destroyed or lost decades ago. In 2020, investigators used ground-penetrating radar to search the former Sodder property, looking for anything that might have been buried. They found nothing conclusive. Some anomalies in the soil, but nothing that proved bodies were buried there. The mystery remains unsolved. 75 years later, we still don't know what happened to Morris, Martha Lewis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder. The Sodder children case has become one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, not just because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. The investigation that never occurred, the answers that were never sought, the family that was never believed. George and Jenny Sodder spent their lives searching. They never gave up, never accepted the official story, never stopped believing their children were alive. Were they right, or were they torturing themselves with false hope? We'll probably never know, but their story raises important questions about how we handle missing children cases, about how seriously we take parents' concerns, about the importance of thorough investigation. In 1945, when children went missing, there was no Amber Alert, no national database, no FBI involvement unless specific federal crimes were proven. Local authorities handled missing persons cases with limited resources and sometimes limited interest. If the Sodder case happened today, it would be different. Federal investigators would be involved immediately. Forensic teams would analyze every detail. The media would amplify the search. But in 1945, a poor Italian-American family in rural West Virginia had no such support. The surviving Sodder children grew up with the shadow of that night hanging over them. They remember their siblings, remember the fire, remember their parents' desperate search. Sylvia, the youngest survivor, has spoken publicly about the experience. Now in her 80s, she still wonders about her missing siblings. I dream about them sometimes, she says. I imagine them alive somewhere, old like me now, with families of their own, but not knowing who they really are. That's the most tragic possibility, that the children grew up not knowing they'd been kidnapped, not knowing their real family was searching for them, not knowing they were loved and missed. If they were integrated into other families, legally or illegally, they might have been told their parents died, or abandoned them, or didn't want them. They might have lived entire lives under false identities, never knowing the truth. Some of them might still be alive. Maurice would be 93. Martha would be 91. Louis would be 88. Jenny would be 87. Betty would be 84. If any of them read this story, would they recognize themselves? Would they remember anything from before the fire? Or has too much time passed? Too many false memories implanted? The photograph of Louis that George received in 1968 has been analyzed by modern facial recognition experts. They compared it to childhood photos of Louis. The results were inconclusive. The photo could be Louis, but it could also be another child with similar features. With 1960s photographic limitations, certainty is impossible. The cryptic message on the back, Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, Ilil Boys, A90132, has never been decoded. Some believe Ilil Boys refers to a location. Others think it's a misspelling or code. A90132 might be a case number, or a date, or meaningless. Over the decades, dozens of people have claimed to be one of the missing Sodder children. All were investigated. All were proven false. Some were genuine delusions, people who'd convinced themselves they were kidnapped. Sodders. Others were scammers hoping for money or attention. The real children, if alive, have never come forward, never contacted the surviving family, never revealed themselves. In 1989, just before Jenny Sodder's death, she received one last lead. A woman claimed she'd seen all 5 children at a church gathering in the 1950s. They were together, the woman said, being cared for by a religious order. I think they'd been placed in protection, but I don't know where. Jenny wanted to investigate, but she was too ill. She died days later, still hoping, still wondering. The surviving Sodder children have mixed feelings about the mystery. Some believe their siblings died. Others think they might have been taken, or wish they had closure. We'll never stop wondering, one family member said. It's like a wound that never heals. We can't grieve properly because we don't know if there's anything to grieve. That's the cruelty of unsolved disappearances. The not knowing, the eternal maybe. Families of missing persons often say the worst part isn't the loss, it's the uncertainty, the hope that tortures, the constant question, are they alive? The Sodder family has lived with that question for 75 years. Modern cold case investigators occasionally review the file. But with no physical evidence remaining, no witnesses still alive, and no DNA to test, there's little they can do. The case is effectively unsolvable now. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence lost. Unless someone comes forward, unless one of the children, now elderly, learns the truth and speaks up, unless someone on their deathbed confesses. But as the years pass, that becomes less likely. The generation that might have known what happened is dying. The children themselves, if alive, would be in their 80s and 90s. Time is running out. The Sodder family story reminds us of several important things. First, authorities must take missing persons cases seriously. George and Jenny were dismissed, their concerns ignored, their evidence rejected because they were poor, because they were immigrants, because they were just a family from a small town. That should never happen. Every missing child deserves a thorough investigation. Every parent deserves to be heard. Second, we need better systems for tracking and finding missing children. The improvements since 1945 are significant, but gaps still exist. Third, the pain of not knowing is unbearable. Families of missing persons need support, counseling, resources, help, processing the unique trauma of ambiguous loss. The Sodder family faced that trauma alone for decades. Finally, some mysteries may never be solved, and that's a hard truth to accept. We want answers. We want closure. We want to believe every mystery has a solution waiting to be found. But sometimes the truth is lost. The witnesses die. The evidence decays. And we're left with only questions. The 5 Sodder children vanished on Christmas Eve, 1945. Whether they died that night or lived for decades afterward, we don't know. What we do know is this: a family was destroyed. Parents spent their lives searching. No evidence. Just 3 women gone. One was a recent high school graduate. celebrating. The next morning, she was supposed to leave for a trip. She never showed up. Police found the house undisturbed, beds slept in, purses left behind, but the women were gone. 30 years later, no one knows what happened to them. You won't want to miss that one. Until then, remember, some people vanish without a trace. Some families search forever, and some mysteries remain unsolved no matter how hard we look. The Sodder children are among them. 5 kids who disappeared on the most magical night of the year and left behind only questions and heartbreak. They deserve to be remembered. Their family deserves to be honored, and their story deserves to be told. Even if we never learn the truth, siblings grew up haunted by loss and unanswered questions. And somewhere in ashes or memory, 5 children disappeared, leaving only their photos, their names, and the question that will never be answered. What really happened to the Sodder children? If this mystery has stayed with you, hit that subscribe button. There are more unsolved disappearances to explore, more families still searching, more questions that need attention. What do you think happened to the Sodder children? Do you believe they died in the fire? Were they kidnapped? Could any still be alive? Let me know in the comments. Next week, we're investigating another American mystery. The Springfield Three. In 1992, 3 women vanished from a house in Missouri. No signs of struggle,